everybody, welcome to McNally Jackson. It's nice to have you here. Nice crowd tonight. Celebrate disaster capitalism. Disaster has become big business. Best-selling journalist Anthony Lowenstein travels across Afghanistan, Pakistan, Haiti, Papua New Guinea, United States, Britain, Greece, and Australia to witness the reality of disaster capitalism. He discovers how companies cash in on organized misery in a hidden world of privatized detention centers, militarized private security, aid profiteering, and destructive mining. What emerges through Lowenstein's reporting is a dark history of multinational corporations that, with the aid of the media and political elites, have grown more powerful than national governments. In the 21st century, the vulnerable have become the world's most valuable commodity. Noam Chomsky says, "A chilling study based on careful and courageous reporting and illuminated with perspective analysis helps us understand all too well the saying that man is a wolf to man." Anthony Lowenstein is a Middle East-based Australian independent freelance journalist, author, documentarian, and blogger. He has written for The Guardian, The New York Times, The Washington Post, The New Statesman, and many other publications. Tonight he is joined by Ben Norton, a journalist and writer whose work primarily focuses on U.S. foreign policy, the Middle East, and movements for economic and social justice. He has written for Alternet, The Intercept, Salon.com, and other publications. Please make our guests feel very welcome.
Thanks all for coming out tonight. Appreciate it, and it should be a good discussion. Hopefully I'll try to stop talking as much as possible and let him speak. But I'll just give a little introduction here. I'll say it's a privilege to introduce Anthony. He's been a big influence on me. His work is incredible. He's also in many ways I think one of the most accomplished journalists that I can think of, not just in terms of bylines, but in terms of stories he's covered, places he's been to. Do you know the number of countries you've been to? It's in the dozens, clearly.
In the dozens. I couldn't give you a number, but yeah, quite a few.
40, 50, 60?
Yeah, at least.
Yeah, I mean, I've been in correspondence with him for a while. I interviewed him for a piece I wrote for Salon last year about this book. And every time I emailed him, he was not only in another country, he was on another continent. He would, at one moment, he would be in Asia somewhere, like East Asia, and then he was in Mongolia, he was in the Middle East, he was in Kenya, he was in Latin America. So it's great to be able to speak with him tonight. And also, what's great about Anthony is he's the definition of cosmopolitan. I've been reading his work for a while, and I remember a few years ago he wrote this piece in The Guardian, which is a pretty reflexive, kind of personal piece, and the headline is something like, I'll see if I can get this as a mouthful, "I'm an Australian, Jewish, atheist, German, anti-Zionist, and this is my story."
That sounds about right.
And just seeing the breadth of experiences and background that he has and how that comes out of his reporting is great. But of course, we're here to talk about this tome tonight, which is incredibly ambitious, as he said in the introduction. This book is really, in some ways, kind of like 6 books in one. For disaster capitalism, which is based in some part on a previous book he wrote called Prophets of Doom, although this is certainly its own work. For this book, he went to Afghanistan, Pakistan, Papua New Guinea, his native Australia, the U.S., the U.K., Greece as well. And I think what's interesting about this book is not only does it cover an enormous breadth of material, that not only does it encompass all these countries and these different conflicts, but it's actually very prescient. So this book was published 2 years ago now, and in this book he was talking a lot about the refugee crisis and how corporations have been profiting from the refugee crisis. There's often a discussion of that without the economic understanding of what is actually happening. This isn't just a conflict that's happening in the void without any foreign intervention. In some ways the military-industrial complex is fueling this, they're profiting off of it in many different ways. And he was writing about this and researching it years ago before it became, this important topic that people have been talking about. Of course, we're living right now in the worst refugee crisis since World War II. And according to the UN, 60 million people have been displaced throughout the world, mostly by violent conflicts. His reporting really gets to the heart of that. So just to begin here, you don't need to go in depth yet too much, but can you talk a little bit about what you mean when you say disaster capitalism? Because it's a provocative phrase, and of course in some ways it's derived from Naomi Klein. In 2007 she wrote a really canonical work, The Shock Doctrine, talking about the rise of disaster capitalism, looking historically Chile under after the coup, the U.S.-backed coup, under Pinochet, and looking at other different conflicts, and yet Haiti, where Anthony also visited to see the aftermath of the earthquake there. Can you talk about the concept of disaster capitalism, and maybe just introduce the idea before we get into different case studies of what it is?
I want to thank you all for coming tonight, and thank you, Ben, for doing this as well. It's great to be here. I'm Australian, but living in Jerusalem. Bless you.
Thank you.
And to me, the reason I called the book Disaster Capitalism was, I think, to do with the idea that it really means making money from misery. That could be a range of things. That could be, as you say, immigration. It could be aid, war, mining, natural resources. And I guess when I was starting to work on this book, which is probably now about 2010, books take a absurdly long time to write and research. One doesn't do it full time because you have to raise the money to travel to these far out places. But I really wanted to try to find some overarching ideology or way to describe what I saw happening in a multitude of countries. So, on the face of it, you often see journalism about Afghanistan or Haiti, and sometimes it's good, sometimes it's awful. But I was looking for more the economic motive, which clearly often drives these questions. It doesn't always drive every issue, but it drives a lot of them. So the countries I chose, I could have chosen 10 others. They weren't chosen particularly because I could have chosen Iraq over Afghanistan. In other words, I chose countries that I thought were a great example, or bad example in a way, of how these corporations and individuals, in my view, have become more powerful than the state. And when you have a situation, this is not to idealise the state. This is not a question of saying, if only, for example, in the US, all the prisons are run by the state, therefore everything would be fine. There'd still be 2.3 million people in prison tonight, whether they're under the private or public system. However, so the issue is more a mass incarceration culture, which clearly in the US is an endemic problem. It's only going to get worse now with your great new president. So, which was very bad under Obama too, by the way. We'll get to the issue of often the blindness of much of the left when it came to Obama in the last 8 years. But I wanted to see like an overarching ideology behind it, and Disaster Capitalism, I read Naomi Klein's book. I thought it explained a lot of what I was thinking, and I wanted to sort of develop and expand that thesis. The refugee issue was a central one. I had spent a lot of time in the last 10 years in Australia, my home country, home birth country. And we'll get to this a bit later, I know, but the way in which the US and Europe treats refugees now, that's often in the news in the last year, was pioneered in Australia. And often you have European and American leaders praising the way Australia treats refugees incredibly harshly. The system is privatised, and I'll explain a bit more about that later. The book goes into detail about it. So for me, it was a way to encompass a larger argument, and also a chance to go to places I was dying to go to. And for me, as I said, the issue I think was also just finally about saying that for me, too much journalism is embedded. And the term embedded often, as many of us will have heard, is a post 9/11 expression. A journalist goes to Afghanistan with US troops. That's obviously an embedding. And that can be often very myopic journalism because it's very much what the US or Australian or British troops want you to see. But I think it's broader than that. I think embedded journalism is often a psychological condition where a lot of journalists, if they go to Haiti or if they go to Afghanistan, they are too often not focused on those who are suffering the most. They could be, in Afghanistan, obviously victims of war. They could be people who are those who are being exploited in a range of different ways. So I didn't want to be an embedded journalist. I wanted to go to places and not go sort of on a State Department tour. I'm not saying every journalist does that, of course they don't. But many do, and that's more a philosophical issue about, I think, what journalism has become to too many people. Sort of an insider access style journalism, which I think is one reason why I think journalism is in deep trouble long before Donald Trump took office.
Absolutely. And in war zones like Afghanistan, that can be a very dangerous thing. So maybe this is a good segue. Can we talk a little bit about, you spent time in Afghanistan, you spent time in Pakistan as well. And before we even talk about the current refugee crisis, largely because of the wars in Syria, the wars in Iraq, Afghanistan has had millions of refugees as well, many displaced by the US war, which is now in its 16th year.
It's the longest war in US history.
Absolutely, the longest ground war. and there's almost no discussion of it. It's like, you know, there are these conflicts going on. Last year, in its last year, the administration of Nobel Prize winner Barack Obama dropped 26,000 bombs on southern Muslim majority countries, one of which was, of course, Afghanistan. Also Iraq, Syria, Libya. There's almost no discussion of it. Can you talk about what your experience was with Afghanistan and how this is directly related, of course, to the refugee crisis? Because again, we talk about the refugee crisis as if it's some issue that's not in any way related to what we are doing. We talk about it as if it's an unfortunate tragedy that our hands are clean in regard to, but they're certainly not.
The hands are dirty. Let's make that very clear. I mean, all our hands are dirty. I mean, the US is obviously the key player here, but so is Britain, so is Australia, so a range of other Muslim countries. So I went to Afghanistan in 2012 and 2015. 2012, I was there researching the book principally, looking at the role of privatised military contractors and the ways in which the Afghan war and the Iraq war, for that matter, have become principally fueled around contractors making money, whether it's security, whether it's protection, whether it's the mining industry, for example. I'll get to that in a minute. So I was there as an independent journalist. You find a hopefully safe place to stay. I was staying mostly in Kabul, but I also travelled from the capital. Back then, in 2012, the situation obviously was pretty dire. It's got far, far worse since, security-wise, violence-wise. Not that many journalists are based there anymore full-time because, as you were saying, Ben, before, it's pretty much invisible in the US. Although last year was the highest rate of civilian deaths since 2001. The Taliban now control more territory than any time since 2001 when they were kicked out by the US. It's dire.
I mean, and if you look at the UN mission in Afghanistan statistics, they release a graph every few months. If you just look over the past few years, civilian casualties have increased without exception in the past 5 years.
And some of those deaths are coming from US forces and some from the Taliban and some from ISIS and a range of other groups. So it's not just the US, but it's a range of actors.
And the fact that ISIS is even in Afghanistan.
Absolutely. Well, when I was there last time in 2015, I was there with a colleague who's actually here tonight, Thor, a new writer. We're making a film also called Disaster Capitalism, which I'll talk a bit more later. And we were there looking at the mining industry there, or the attempted mining industry there, sold to Afghans and the world as the possibility of a way to rescue Afghans' economic future. It's a delusional, in my view, idea. Apart from the fact the country's war-torn, that's a problem, point one. Point two, the idea somehow that you sell mining as a way to bring economic prosperity to your people. I mean, as I say in the book, there are barely any examples in the world where that has happened. I'm not saying a mine has never brought prosperity, but in the vast, vast majority of cases it does not happen, apart from environmental issues, climate change problems, a range of other issues.
So, I mean, look at Appalachia. I mean, it's clearly worked out very well there.
And there's a range of examples I talk about in the book, like Papua New Guinea as well, where mining has brought absolute disaster to the population there. So I think in Afghanistan what you have is a so-called US-led counterinsurgency plan put in place by the Bush administration, followed up by the Obama administration, which will probably be continued by the Trump administration. But one of the key things about that war, which a lot of people don't realise, which has been done also in Iraq as well, it was sold as an idea that you can either pay off your enemy to stop them killing you or attacking you, point one, which short-term can work a little bit, but essentially you're paying money to really, really bad people. Not only, but solely, principally. And in Afghanistan and Iraq, there was an attempt to try and do that, to pay off people who you would deem to be enemies, bad guys, call them whatever you want. The other problem in Afghanistan, which has only got worse, is the US was backing, funding, arming, training the worst warlords imaginable. So the Afghan government, the Hamid Karzai government and now Ashraf Ghani, they're inherently corrupt, pretty awful regimes, but the US government and British government and Australian government were and are backing warlords in a range of reasons. In theory, to back their own mission, but in practice, what the effect of that has been is that locals are incredibly pissed off with the fact that they see the US supporting warlords, a warlord who doesn't give them decent education. And the reason why the Taliban, as awful as they may be, do have some support within the country is not because people are idealising an authoritarian regime. In some areas, the Taliban bring a degree of security, and this is all relative. It's not great, don't get me wrong. And as you said, with ISIS appeared in the last couple of years. It's very difficult to get an accurate assessment of how many ISIS fighters are in Afghanistan. Nobody knows, but they're definitely there. I mean, Thor and I were there a few years ago. There were certain parts of the country we considered going to film our movie, and we were told, and advice that we took, those areas are probably do have ISIS. Like literally to the point where someone would say to us, between the hours of 2 and 4 along this road, ISIS guys might be there, but 4 to 7 could be okay. Literally that's what you get told. You think it's not worth the risk. ISIS, you don't want to fuck with ISIS. They're not the nicest guys around, and we're two lovely Western guys, so we're not the best option. So,
Yeah, and this might be a good segue. I mean, unfortunately, we could talk about the war in Afghanistan all night. But this is, of course, related. I mean, the refugee crisis is a global crisis. Millions of refugees are coming from several countries. Afghanistan is a major generator of refugees, and the war there, which again has almost no discussion. It was barely even mentioned in the presidential election.
at all.
But there are many Afghan refugees. There are Syrian, there are Iraqi refugees. You spent time in Greece, which is one of the largest taker of asylum seekers and refugees. In many ways, this is one of the most impoverished countries in Europe, and it has been actually forced to accept many because a lot of Western European countries are refusing to take refugees. Can you talk about what you saw in Greece and how this relates, to this global crisis overall?
Let me just mention one thing about Afghanistan briefly. As Ben rightly says, there's been a huge number of Afghans who have fled in the last 15 years. Many of them had fled before the Afghan war because the Taliban was a very repressive regime. And it's interesting to note last year in 2016, Pakistan has hundreds of thousands of Afghan refugees who have come into Pakistan because they thought that maybe Pakistan was slightly safer than Afghanistan. Last year, Pakistan forcibly sent back 600,000 Afghan refugees back into Afghanistan, to a country that's war-torn, to a country that has very few resources, healthcare, education. It's an unmitigated disaster. And what's so awful about it is the fact that a lot of those refugees are still going to want to leave. There's almost this sense, I think, in so much of the, maybe not in this room here, but in the Western discussion about refugees, that, well, they shouldn't be coming here and it's not our problem and they can just go back to where they came from, essentially, wherever
They
they
can't
might be.
because you're bombing that area. You
Minor
create
detail.
a war there.
Exactly. And of course the crazy so-called logic about this is, well, if the US and other countries, including Australia, are receiving these refugees, and Australia, for example, and Britain, they are now sending refugees back to Afghanistan, claiming it's a safe country for people to live, which is an absurdity. And a number of those people we know have either been disappeared or been killed by the Taliban, by other forces, who knows.
Including hundreds of unaccompanied Afghan children.
Absolutely. In Greece, I was there at a time where, as many of you will know, the country in the last, pretty much since the financial crisis in 2008, has suffered deeply from austerity imposed by a supposedly benevolent European Union and associated financial institutions. And the result has been a country that was what you call a first world country to a country that is in deep financial trouble. And what that means for average people is, for example, healthcare has collapsed. A lot of people who would live relatively middle class lives now cannot afford basic medicines. And I spent time with some of these individuals. What I guess was inspiring there, before I get to the darker side, was that it's almost forced communities to rise up and act. The government, both the previous government, the Conservative government, even Syriza, which is the current left-wing government, Syriza came in, for a lot of people, including me, with a lot of hopes. They were going to reject austerity, they were going to take a stand against these awful bankers. The fact is they capitulated very quickly, and Greece remains a disaster.
And also did not have an option. They were left with an option of leaving Europe, or capitulating and giving in to austerity.
There was a gun to their head, to be sure, and I guess the argument for another time whether they could have chosen to leave Europe. But yes, they made the decision to stay within the EU, and they are in deep financial trouble. The effect of that, which leads to the refugee issue, is yes, Greece has taken many refugees in the last years, and Greece, on one level, is a liberal country, but also a deeply conservative country. And let's not forget, Greece was a dictatorship until the 70s. It's not long ago, that's my lifetime. It's quite recent. and there's now a party there called Golden Dawn, which is a far-right neo-Nazi party. It is proudly a neo-Nazi party. It's the third largest party in the Greek parliament. It's not running the country, but it's powerful. And the effect of that sort of party on the streets for a number of years, including to this day, is you have Golden Dawn-aligned thugs bashing refugees and bashing Muslims and attacking refugee businesses, and the police often, though not all, work in collusion with Golden Dawn. They turn a blind eye. In fact, at many polling stations in the last years, police are disproportionately supportive of what Golden Dawn stands for.
Yeah, some polls show as many as half of police in Greece voted for Golden Dawn.
For Golden Dawn. So a neo-Nazi party is proudly in power. Its leadership from the top down is various forms of thuggery, and I spent some time with some of these charming people when I was there as a nice Jewish boy from Australia, and weirdly enough, I talk about this in the book, these guys love Israel. Now, the book's not about Israel, a lot of my work is, but this is weird, although not that surprising as you've written about and I have as well. There's a weird confluence now of issues that many on the far right, who traditionally would hate Jews, now frame Israel as a so-called saviour in the world because A, it's seen as being at the forefront of the so-called war on terror, doesn't like Muslims, it treats refugees in their view in a great way, which is a bad way, and this sort of confluence is what we're seeing also here in the US, which we'll get to, but there is a sense, isn't there, that the far right really, which traditionally was an enemy of Jews, and might be correctly, for some, and what's even more disturbing is that there are some prominent members of the Jewish community here, the Jewish establishment here, who are very happy to welcome the far right into their arms. For them, if you love Israel, no questions asked. If you're anti-Semitic, no questions asked. And this has been clear since Trump has won. So in Greece, on a smaller scale, I saw that. I saw some of these so-called intellectuals behind Golden Dawn. I talk about this in the book. These are not stupid people. I mean, obviously, I fundamentally oppose what they stand. These are not. There's two different levels of Golden Dawn, and often with these sort of parties, there are the thugs on the street who are beating people up. Then there's the so-called intellectuals behind it who can articulate in a clever way. They're not stupid about why you need a far-right fascist party to run your country much better. You know, the trains are run on time. That kind of mentality. And the effect is that although when the last government came into power in Greece, there was a slight initial softening of attitudes from the government perspective to refugees, sadly, one of the conditions having a gun to their head from austerity from the EU was you need to crack down on refugees harder. You need to put refugees in appalling refugee camps. And the effect of that has been a lot of people are now avoiding Greece. Some people still go there because there's no choice. If their boat is leaving and they need to get somewhere relatively safe, Greece is going to be safer than Afghanistan, than Syria, of course. So it's a pretty grim picture there, and I think Europe has, this is before Europe took a massive right turn, which is going to go a lot a lot more right this year. They made conscious, open decisions, as I discuss in the book, often working with corporations to make a hell of a lot of money, to lock people up, to isolate them, to provide bad healthcare and bad food. And when you have millions of people literally coming into Europe, many of whom have come, as Ben said, from countries that we in the West are bombing, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria via proxies, etc., etc., to me you have a deep moral responsibility, let alone what is the supposed suggestion here. You can shut the borders to an extent, you can build walls, and that's what Europe is doing. It's what Trump's going to probably do, build a high wall or more walls. And to some extent, what's disturbing, I guess, having written about this issue and investigated for so long is that the immediate response to that is, you and I would say, it's not going to work, it doesn't work. The truth is, in the short term, in inverted commas, it can work. Work meaning, in the definition of, you can slow the numbers of people coming, you can make it more difficult, you can make life harder for those who do get in. You can do that. Now, is that going to stop people fleeing Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, etc.? Probably not. Will it stop them going to a better country? Maybe. Will it mean that they're likely to stay in their own countries when their countries are war-torn? I mean, let's not forget, the vast majority of refugees stay in their region. They do not come to Europe or the US or Australia. They're staying around their communities if they can. So, you really, in the last few years, Europe, the supposedly enlightened Europe, has taken in a lot of people, to be sure, and some countries have done it better than others, but overall there is a growing authoritarian streak that says we believe as struggling parties, political parties, we're going to be tougher to try to appease the far-right surge in our countries. And it's not working because the far-right is surging. It's going to do very well this year in France and Germany and elsewhere.
Yeah, this month in France, Marine Le Pen, a far-right candidate from the National Front, whose father is a neo-Nazi. She distanced herself from her father, but her father is a Holocaust denier who is in court in France found guilty of Holocaust denial. She is leading in many of the polls. In fact, the more centrist right-wing and centrist candidates made a pact recently, just this week, in order to try to undermine her in the polls. So it's a very
She's
dangerous
doing well,
time.
and Trump administration is supporting parties like that. That's been said very openly.
Geert Wilders and the Freedom Party in the Netherlands are also leading. So it's a dangerous time. You said something interesting, actually, which I was thinking about beginning this discussion with, but this is a better segue here. And he begins this book, Disaster Capitalism, with a very interesting quote. And you made a point about how, in the long term, these solutions are not going to, these so-called solutions are not going to work, which is very clear. But that also, to some people who are making these decisions, and some people who are in particular profiting from these decisions, they aren't necessarily interested in the long term. And he has an interesting quote that he opens this book with from a Norwegian professor at the Norwegian Business School who studies climate strategy, but he also has a business background. And he wrote this interesting quote that you begin the book with. Quote, "It is profitable to let the world go to hell. I believe that the tyranny of the short term will prevail over the decades to come. As a result, a number of long-term problems will not be solved, even if they could have been, and even as they cause gradually increasing difficulties for all voters." And of course we see this. We see this, the refugee crisis is a great example, but it's not just that. Growing inequality. In the case of Greece, you have the Eurozone forcing a country that the IMF, the right-wing IMF, this is certainly not a left-wing bastion, admitted would be unable to pay off of its debt thanks to these austerity measures. So Yanis Varoufakis, the former finance minister of Greece, said that this is kind of fairy economics. It does not actually make any scientific sense, even from a neoliberal capitalist framework. It's not even just that these people have some ideological interest, it's that they are incapable institutionally of doing whatever it is that they want because there are people profiting off of this. These conflicts are very profitable, they're intransigent, and it's not profitable in the short term to solve any of these long-term problems. You may raise a lot of really good points, and there's a lot we could discuss further. I mean, maybe we should segue a little bit more, because I don't want to spend too much time on one issue, because your book covers so much. Can you talk a little bit about Australia? Because a lot of Americans, of course we know basic things about Australia, but to be frank, a lot of Americans...
Koalas and kangaroos and all that
Right, I mean, that's half the country, right? And settler colonialism. The perfect combination. I mean, U.S. is also a settler colonial state, so solidarity based on genocide.
Shit values.
But a lot of Americans don't really follow day-to-day Australian politics, and as you mentioned, for years, even before we were talking about the refugee crisis, as if it just emerged out of the void a few years ago, Australia has been interning, you could use the term interning, or imprisoning refugees in privatized facilities, in some ways similar to what the U.S. is doing on its southern border. Many people fleeing Latin America are economic migrants. They could be considered refugees. Some lawyers have argued this under international law. Many are fleeing violence from the U.S.-backed drug war. They're fleeing, in the case of Mexico, NAFTA policies that have destroyed local economies on behalf of large agribusiness, etc. So there's been this gradual process for years that Australia pioneered of privatizing detention of people who are often fleeing Western-backed policies. Can you talk about how Australia is really, in some ways, speaking of settler colonialism, it's kind of this pioneer in this brave new world, this kind of manifest destiny for privatization of detention?
So Australia is the only country in the world that has privatised all of its immigration facilities. Some countries have got private and some are public. It's the only country. This started about 20 years ago. And Australia, for those who don't know, is the same geographic size as the US, but there's 24 million people. So it's pretty small, or small population-wise. Most of the country's empty, essentially. It's too hot to live there, etc., etc. So there's always been this weird fear in Australia of what we call so-called boat people. The idea somehow that Australia could be invaded by Indonesia. I mean, it's an absurd idea, by the way. But that fear goes back a long way for lots of different reasons I won't get into. But there is this fear somehow being invaded by non-Western country, a country above us, so to speak. Ironically, of boat, because they've flown there for Iraq, wherever it may be. Ironic on so many levels, not least the i.e. the British who came by boat. But Australia started interning refugees in Australia itself. That then morphed as time went on offshore Australia. It pays off poor Pacific islands, Nauru, which is its own country, Manus Island, which is a small area in Papua New Guinea, which is again very close to our north. And people are housed there in privatised, awful conditions, often for years. Journalists cannot get in, the UN sometimes gets in, human rights groups occasionally get in. So you can imagine if these facilities are either on the Australian mainland or in the Pacific, access is difficult by definition. So most Australians don't see it, don't seem to care that much about it. And this really, I think, goes to the heart of how Australia has been running these camps for so long. A few different points on that. One, Europe now is talking about offshoring its refugee policy. Europe has talked in the last while, in fact for years, but more so recently, of establishing refugee camps in Libya, which is on its face an absurd idea considering it's a war zone. And the idea somehow that before refugees leave Libya, many of whom do go via there to get to Europe, they'll be somehow processed and assessed whether they're kosher refugees. If not, they'll be sent to somewhere. On its face, it's an absurd idea, but it's being talked about. European leaders, some far-right European leaders have admired Australia. During the Brexit debate, for example, in the UK, Nigel Farage, one of the key Brexit people amongst others, admired Australia's refugee policy. Various politicians here in the US and the Republican Party have admired Australia's refugee policy. And what really is so painful about this issue is that it becomes a point, I suppose, after a policy hasn't stayed the same over 20 years. It's evolved and it's gone back and forth, and different parties have gone into power, and the Labor Party, which is the more sort of centre-left, although it's awful, but a bit better than the other side, which is called the Liberal Party in our country, which is actually conservative. It's very confusing.
That's how it is in most of the world.
Yeah, I know, yeah. Our two-party system is as broken as yours. But in general, there is this idea somehow that if you are cruel to refugees for years and years, it will get you votes. Fear works. And I guess this is an issue where those of us who have opposed it through journalism, through writing, through activism, through protests, say to ourselves, although I don't live in Australia now, I follow this issue closely because it's a painful one, and I can see Australia now being a supposed model for the rest of the world. You ask yourselves, after 20 years, this has got majority support. It's been going on for 20 or so years. A lot of people are supporting. A lot of people, I'm not saying Australia, everyone is racist. I mean, there's racism like any country. But there is a sense somehow that people, their fears can be managed if we keep refugees over there somewhere. Not in front of us. Just in a camp. And if you privatise it, which Australia has done, and obviously the US has done to an extent, and I think that's going to increase now with the Trump era, you can obviously treat people worse, because if a private company runs a facility, what are they going to do? Spend less on food, less on healthcare, less on medical care. This is happening in your country and Australia as well. Despite the fact in Australian offshore camps, people are being murdered. Whereas people, I mean, it has got as bad as it could possibly get, and yet it still receives majority Australian support. So I go into detail about that in the book, and I visited many of these camps, the ones that you can visit. The ones in the Pacific are mostly inaccessible, so you can't really get in there. And the idea somehow of keeping refugees, many of whom I should say, just to be very clear, the vast, vast majority are seen to be refugees. The UN accepts them as being refugees. This is not this so-called economic migrants that I think the critics of refugee policy give, which is they're just escaping for a better quality of life, as if somehow that's a problem, by the way. But nonetheless, traditionally the UN rules say that you need to be fearing for your life, essentially. And the majority of these people are. They're coming from countries, as I said, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, sometimes Sri Lanka. Obviously there was a civil war there, you may know, that ended a few years ago. and the Tamil population were massacred in huge numbers. So a lot of Tamils came to Australia during that war and before that war. So our policy in Australia, I shouldn't say our, the policy in Australia has been brutally effective. And the privatised nature of it has made it far worse because the lack of accountability is out of control. That companies, British companies, American companies, Australian companies are incredibly effective at deflecting responsibility. Things go wrong, someone gets murdered, someone gets attacked, people lose their legs, people have to get their limbs amputated. There is an unhealthy collusion between what we call the immigration department and these private companies to make people suffer. The message is supposed to be very, very clear. They want refugees to tell their families back in country X, do not come here. Do not come here. It's not a good place. Now, Australia does still take refugees. I'm not saying we haven't taken anyone, it's just a whole white country. It's more diverse than that, thankfully. But our refugee boat people policy is draconian in the extreme.
And I think one of the interesting things about your book, and about your journalism in general, because of course he is an avid writer, he regularly publishes a variety of stories. I saw one recently on the crisis in Honduras, after a US-backed coup there as well. So I mean, there are so many different conflicts that he's covered. Related to that, can you talk about how many of these conflicts are interconnected? I mean, not just in the abstract sense, of course, in the sense that all forms of oppression are interconnected in some way, but in the sense that in the case of Australia and the US, you have people, government officials, business officials, trading different information, intelligence, what works, what doesn't work, what's profitable, what's not profitable. You mentioned Israel. In the case of Israel, this is also a good example. You released a great story last year looking at how the illegal occupation of the West Bank, which is entering its 50th year.
This year.
In June, it'll be the 50th anniversary of Israel's illegal military occupation of the West Bank. In that case, you have, of course, a very close alliance between the U.S. and Israel and Australia.
Yeah.
But in that case, you have very clear connections. You have the U.S., many times the same corporations, using technology that was used by Israel and pioneered in the West Bank on its own southern border against mostly Latino refugees and migrants who are coming into the U.S. In what ways, certainly not just between the U.S. and Israel and Australia, in what ways are these forms of oppression and profiteering not only international but connected?
What we're, I think, seeing, and this was happening before 9/11, but much worse since, is really what I call the Israelification of security policy. Israel has pioneered various techniques to isolate people, occupy people, and what the US did post 9/11, many other countries have as well, is to in many ways follow those methods. I was, I think, saying to you a few days ago, if you read the book by Robert Fisk, who's a British journalist living in Beirut, he wrote a book called Pity the Nation about the Lebanon War. This is long before 9/11, and the way he writes there about how Israel managed, so to speak, its war against Lebanon, the language, the tactics were remarkably similar to what the US was doing post 9/11. There is a connection. I'm not saying that everything that George Bush called up Israel and asked for tips, although there was a great deal of collaboration between the countries which surged after 9/11 between the places. One of the things I talked about in that piece you mentioned was in The Nation, people can read it if they Google and find it, was to show how growing numbers of Israeli companies and American companies are benefiting from the Israelification policy. That could be building borders or fences or monitoring or tagging or a range of other things that the US is increasingly keen to do. When the Trump administration came into power, a lot of the Israeli firms that build walls are over the moon. They see dollar signs, and for some good reason, because already there are conversations, which was happening during the Obama era, I must say, of Israeli firms who are the experts in the field. I mean, the company, I've got a piece coming out shortly, the company that was the key, I guess you'd say, inventor of the isolation of Gaza. So if anyone's been to Gaza, I was there a few months ago, it's essentially an isolated territory controlled by walls, sensors, drones, etc. On one level very effective, people aren't really getting in and out without being checked by Israel or Egypt on the other side. So those companies are speaking to the Obama administration and the Trump administration and various other governments. And this in some ways, and as my piece argued, is a way that Israel hopes, who knows if this is going to happen, but hopes that if there is an increase in boycotts and sanctions and divestment, the so-called BDS movement, that it can be off-played somehow by the fact that its companies are going to be selling its wares around the world. As the world builds more walls and builds more fences and sees the isolating of their own countries as a good thing, which is where Europe is going and the US is going and Australia is going in the coming years, Israel can give expert advice how to do that. Because they're doing it, as I said, in their view, very effectively. And although Israel is isolated internationally, isolated diplomatically on one hand, the UN, whenever there's a vote, if anyone looks at the UN votes, it's usually the entire world over here. And this side is Israel, the US, often Australia, Micronesia, Palau and Nauru. Now the last three countries are client states and, client state. So I always say, what's Australia's excuse? I mean, we're a client state too, we're big guys, sadly. But we're not Nauru. I mean, Nauru is essentially a country that has got not much. It's a very poor nation, and I kind of understand in their logic why they would be happy to, get US support to vote in the UN for Israel, which is kind of weird when you're a country in the Pacific. But I think the point about being connected is these issues are connected because often the same companies are working in various areas. To build walls, as I said, to build security, to build surveillance techniques. And of course, the last side of it, which I'll finish on this, is the role of the NSA. And the NSA, of course, which was, people written about this for a long time, but some of it came out when Edward Snowden, the whistleblower, released all those documents a few years ago explaining the incredibly close nexus between the public and the private in terms of mass spying here and elsewhere. And Israel is not officially, there's something called the so-called Five Eyes, which is some of America's closest allies, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, UK, and another one that I've now forgotten. But 5 key countries. Israel's not part of that 5, but they might as well be as close because they're sharing intelligence with the US all the time. A lot of that intelligence is being gathered by private corporations. And we shouldn't forget that this was happening during the Obama years. It didn't suddenly start on January the 20th. It's been happening for a long time. And to me, the privatization of intelligence, the privatization of security, is deeply concerning. It's bad enough, obviously, if the state collects the information too. That's not okay. But I'm saying when it's run by a private company, by definition, there's no accountability. They keep the material. In fact, I was just hearing a report this week that The Intercept ran about Peter Thiel, who's a Silicon Valley billionaire, supporter of Trump.
The Empire.
And
he's interested in, he actually drinks blood. I'm not joking.
Does he?
He's one of the most eccentric plutocrats you can think of.
Right.
He really is the textbook caricature of the evil capitalist.
Wow, so he sounds like a great guy. He runs a company which is gathering a lot of intelligence and surveillance that works with the US government. Now, my point in saying that is this didn't start when Trump came into power. It's just been there a month. This has been going on for a long time. There is a continuity of empire. And this is something that I talk about in the book a lot, and that comes about the connection between various countries, that things didn't suddenly go from kind of okay to awful on January the 20th. Trump is bad. The policies are going to be awful. This is not for a second to defend the great Donald at all. But it's to say that a lot of these issues during the Bush years and Obama years, there's continuity. Same corporations involved. There's differences, of course. Certain policies change on certain issues. Obama was better than Bush and Trump. Of course that's true. But in general, there's a continuity outside US borders that a lot of Americans don't see or don't want to know, for that matter. And when you, I think, have the extreme privatization agenda, whether it's war or surveillance, which the US has and Israel have perfected so much, they now see that as an export. And a lot of other countries are coming to Israel and the US and saying, help us do the same thing. Help us build walls. Help us isolate our population. Israel can say, from its perspective, well, it's been 50 years. The occupation in their view is not an occupation, but clearly it is. It's been inverted commas successful. There's no chance it's going to win. It's now permanent. It's a permanent occupation. Permanent for the foreseeable future. And that means other countries look at that with admiration. We might look at that with disgust. They look at it as a way to manage an unruly population, Palestinians, in their view.
In the case of Israel, I mean, it's very personal for Anthony. Actually, he lives in Israel, and in recent weeks he's actually come under attack by the Israeli government. He spoke at a press conference with Yair Lapid, an Israeli former minister rather, recently, and asked a question about the occupation, the continuation of these apartheid-style policies against Palestinians, and has been viciously attacked, and now they're threatening to kick him out of the country. So in some ways, Anthony could maybe use some solidarity there. But we've covered a lot of issues here, and we talked about not even all of the countries that you wrote about in your book. But can we maybe step a little bit back more, and I don't know how much longer we'll go on before maybe questions, but can we kind of just reflect on what, maybe you can even put on your pundit hat a little bit more. What do you think people can do to push back against this? Because here, I'll read a little excerpt here that I picked out, because I think what's great about this book is it is in some ways pessimism inducing, right? If you read it, it's easy to be depressed, but at the same time, while it may induce pessimism, it is not necessarily a pessimistic book. And you end the introduction with this interesting quote, and it encompasses one of the points you were just making, and ends on a more optimistic note. You say, quote, "Meanwhile, the erosion of democracy is met with barely a whimper from the political and media establishments. The selling of valuable assets and outsourcing of vital state services occurs because public resistance to it is so minimal, though it is far stronger in countries where people's lives are literally at risk." And of course, as we've seen with the election of Trump, and in other parts of the world, the resistance is growing. So that's certainly a reason to be optimistic. But then you have this final line here, which is a note of optimism, which I think is important. You say, quote, "This book aims to shock, provoke, and reveal a world that has developed by stealth, but also to insist that alternatives are possible." What are those alternatives?
Well, that's a book on its own, but I'll give a few thoughts about that. There's no doubt that the Trump administration presents unique challenges, that his election, the movement around his election, the support that he obviously has in some parts of the US and clearly beyond, is...
Although it is important to stress, he doesn't have that much support. He won with 25% of the eligible vote.
Yeah.
He's the least popular president in recent recorded history, so it is important to stress that.
Exactly.
Every time we talk about his popularity.
Yes. I think it's also conceivable he could easily have 2 terms as well, which might be a bit of an unfortunate thing. Of course, he might be out of office in 2 weeks. I mean, who the hell knows?
He could have 8 terms.
He might have stayed there forever. Yeah. Or he might just pass it down to his lovely kids. Yeah. His kids great. They're really wonderful. Yeah. So, look, what are those alternatives? So, in some ways, I give some examples in the book, but I think in a broader sense, to me, the resistance, for want of a better word, ain't going to come from the mainstream media. It will not. Doesn't mean there aren't journalists at mainstream newspapers doing good work. There are, for sure. There's been some good journalism from every newspaper, including the dreaded Murdoch Press. For sure, there's good journalism that comes from those publications, sometimes. But overall, the resistance will not come from a media class that sees its role as about access. Obviously, a lot of the press, pretty much uniformly, with the exception of Fox News and obviously the Breitbarts and others, supported Hillary. I would say far too uncritically, in my view. What can people do? I think there's a few things. One, I give a few examples in Europe of cities, major cities, that governments have privatised their waters, privatised their resources, privatised a lot of their services. And the people push back. They protested, they wrote petitions, they complained to their politicians, and a lot of them are being reversed across Europe. Now that may well change if and when the far right takes over. I'm talking about the last 5 years. That to me is an inspiring example. There are journalists and activists in other parts of the world who I think, whose voices are not being heard. I think they can be. That can be mean supporting independent press to hear them. And that may involve paying some money for that media. I mean, obviously journalism is in a crisis for a range of reasons, of which finding a decent salary or support for journalists both here and elsewhere is part of that. I think also the issue of what resistance means is having accountability for what's come before. That the idea somehow that we have the resistance from people here in the US who are uncritical towards Hillary Clinton, to me, is an absurdity. The idea that the Democrat Party, in my humble non-American view, is going to be the resistance is an absurdity. It doesn't mean there aren't Democratic politicians who are hopefully going to be great and stand up and be critical. I hope for America's sake that there are, and there will be, and there already are some. But let's be very clear about this. In the majority of cases with the Democrats, everyone else is being blamed except for them. It was WikiLeaks' fault. It was Russia's fault. It was 1,000 other people's fault. And they may well have all played a part, sure. But ultimately, I would argue it's because the Democrats put up an incredibly flawed candidate in a period where a so-called insurgent was called for.
Yeah,
Whether it was Bernie Sanders, who knows, maybe. I mean, obviously Trump, in a sort of crazy, weird way, framed himself as an outsider, although he's an incredible insider. Not so much in Washington, but obviously in the elites in the US. He could do that successfully from his perspective for lots of different reasons. So,
I mean, it's also important to stress when we're talking about this that, Bernie Sanders, who also has his own issues, certainly.
Sure.
I'm not speaking of him uncritically, but Bernie Sanders is actually, right now, according to numerous polls, and has been for months, the most popular politician in the U.S. Hillary Clinton was the second least popular presidential candidate after Trump. So, I mean, it's important to have that perspective, and looking at how some members of the Democratic Party have responded, and I've reported on this in the past several weeks. There were 3,000 people outside Chuck Schumer's apartment in Brooklyn chanting "resist or resign." Some people some senators and some prominent members of the Democratic Party supported people like Ben Carson in the case of Elizabeth Warren. And of course, if we're talking about Bernie Sanders, it's important to understand that the DNC, we now know, systematically undermined his campaign. We know from leaked emails as well that Hillary Clinton and the DNC, her campaign in the DNC, purposefully helped give rise to Trump. They called it the Pied Piper strategy, and they saw him as this extreme candidate that would guarantee them a victory if they could just get rid of the more conventional Republicans. So certainly, it's important to understand that although Trump is a uniquely horrific person and candidate politically, it's important to see, as you mentioned, for the past several minutes, that this is part of a longer political process.
I think also, what I think is generally lacking at the moment, and this obviously is up to Americans if they want to do something about that in the coming months and years, is where would an inspiring movement leadership come from? Who are those people? Now obviously one could argue there shouldn't be leadership, it depends how if you view the Occupy movement as an ideal model. That's an argument I guess for another day, but in other words, where is that leadership coming from? Is it from certain prominent groups? Is it from the Democrats? I would argue no, but some would say yes. Where is that coming from? So the political situation 3 months after the election, I'd say right now, is pretty grim. I don't know where that's going to come from yet, and that's up to Americans to decide. However, I do think there's a role for citizens to play to deal with corporations. This sense somehow that we have no control over that is not true. There are a range of things one can do. One can organise boycotts, one can organise dealing with shareholder meetings, one can organise protests against CEOs, one can boycott certain products if there are products that certain companies are selling. There is one person doing it is good, but not all that effective, obviously. A collective is important. And there are examples of that happening against, for example, companies who were running the privatised detention camps in Australia over the last years, where mass protests, I should say, and activism against those companies, I think it's had a degree of effect. Some of them have left Australia, of course they're replaced by another company, unfortunately, but there are ways that people collectively can act against corporations that are behaving badly or immorally or often illegally. I think there's finally on that point, the question of what resistance looks like also needs to be, to me, a far more accountable press. That there is willful amnesia in much of the press about so many of these questions, where you now have some of the key advocates for the Iraq War in 2003 who were never held accountable for that, in my view, outrage, who are now apparently leading the so-called resistance against Donald Trump. Now, if you think people like David Frum, for example, who was a speechwriter for George Bush's part of the resistance, this room probably would not think that. But he's framing himself, and the media frames him as opposing Donald Trump and therefore part of the resistance. That is in my humble view, a bit of a problem.
Or the CIA. The
Or the
CIA is
CIA.
now suddenly the voice of the resistance. The
And-
CIA that has overthrown democratically elected governments throughout the world for
I agree.
decades.
And of course, what's worrying about that is that many people who are liberals, who are Democrats, are hoping that the intelligence services and the CIA will either overthrow Trump. I mean, they're saying it openly. It's not like it's some conspiracy theory. It's being said on media, on Twitter, online, on TV. This idea somehow that the intelligence services are going to save us from awful Trump. Well, if you think that they're going to save you from Trump and they're going to overthrow him, let's say he does resign tomorrow, next week, next month, the problem hasn't gone away. And also, do you feel comfortable with the intelligence services doing that? I would argue no. That's just me.
It's because you're not an American.
I know.
You're not
I
patriotic.
say freedom. Yeah.
So I don't know how much. I mean, I think we probably wanted to do some questions, but
Yeah.
I'll actually add one final note, which I should have mentioned earlier. So not only is Disaster Capitalism a book, it's also a film, and Anthony's been working on a documentary called Disaster Capitalism for some years now. It's actually in the final stages of production. I know it's been, inshallah, yeah. I know it's been, a very arduous process. Can you talk a little bit about the film and maybe where people, when it eventually, if and when it eventually comes out, hopefully it will, when they can see it?
So I've been working for a number of years with, as I said before, a New York filmmaker called Thor Newrider, who's in the room over there. And we have been filming in 3 countries, Afghanistan, Haiti and Papua New Guinea. We've been to all those countries twice each. And there's overlapping things with the book, but it's a bit different. It more focuses on the role, often we argue and show, negative role of US aid in those places. How it affects people on the ground and why it should be more accountable. If there's going to be aid, and we argue there should be, but it should be far more accountable. So we have a rough cut of the film. We now have a distributor. We are still needing to work on the film. Is not finished. I'd say 90% or so. We very much are determined it's going to be finished and out this year. I can't exactly say where and how yet, but people can go online. There's a website, Disaster Capitalism Film. You can find out details. There's a trailer, information. It is timely, and we've spent, Thor and I have been working on it for 5 years together. We're doing related work before that, so it's been about 6 years. So it's time to finish it and get it out. Anyone who's made film will know film is an arduous, painful process with hopefully a great payoff. But yeah, we are excited about it coming out, and watch this space.
Yeah, I mean, given the book, I'm sure your labor of love will be amazing. I mean, this book is amazing too, and I guess there are copies. Oh yeah, there are copies right there. There's actually a brand new, I have an older hardcover. There are now...
Just came out in a paperback, so it's great for friends, weddings, bar mitzvahs, whatever.
Were we going to do questions?
Yeah, we got a few minutes. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's...
Okay, do you want to do
Here's a...
Same, thank you so much for your insight.
Thank you.
I've hadn't had a chance to read the book. I was wondering if you'd had a chance to either write or do some reporting on what's going on in Puerto Rico with the 3.5 million U.S. citizens that have a U.S. imposed junta, for lack of a better word. Actually, that's what it is. 7-member board imposed by the U.S., not accountable, not elected. To basically serve as a collection agency for the vulture hedge funds that created the crisis, the $7.4 billion crisis in the first place. As we speak, it closed down the University of Puerto Rico. The students have voted to strike for at least 48 hours. They're on the streets. They're trying to cut $300 million from the system of education. They're trying to privatize everything that they could possibly get their hands on. We were talking about people like John Paulson, et cetera, back like this with Donald Trump. So aside from investigating and looking into that, what sort of advice would you offer to the people in Puerto Rico who are also facing an unprecedented migration to the United States as a result?
I haven't been there, so I don't really want to...
Sure, JetBlue.
Pardon?
I'll give you a ticket.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, well, I'll talk to you about that. I haven't visited, so on one level, I pretty much agree with what you just said. I mean, it's not something I've hugely examined in that particular context, although I know I should have. There's a lot of places in the world where I haven't done so. Next book, yes, possibly.
Well, not to derail for a second. This is an important topic. I can speak to it as well after him. But he's actually working on a new book right now about the drug war, which maybe we can talk about after that. But if you want to keep talking about Puerto Rico.
Yes, I think what the US is doing to Puerto Rico is not dissimilar to what's happened in other places around the world. And that's, I guess, the comparison I would make, the sense somehow that the lack of accountable government is apparently something that the people of Puerto Rico have no say in. And that, to me, should be resisted. I don't want to give advice to people there how to resist. That's up to them. They hopefully, it sounds like they are, and I've been following this too. They are resisting in their ways. I don't want to prescribe what someone in that country should do. It's not my place to do so. But I do think that, again, it's a classic case of very few journalists are going down there to report on it. From here, I mean, it's next door. Is an excuse from Australia, maybe, it's a long way away. It's an excuse from Americans. They don't care. I mean, the same with Honduras, where I was last year, that Honduras is close to the US. It's the site of some of the most refugees coming into the US, and virtually no journalists are going there. I think to ask ourselves why that is.
Yeah, and that is really quickly. I think it's also important to understand that when we're talking about the failure of the political establishment, Puerto Rico is a great example of that. Both parties supported Promesa, the bill he's talking about, which is essentially a colonial-style takeover. In fact, Bob Menendez, the congressman who's often on other issues actually not great in terms of progressive issues, but when it came to Puerto Rico, he actually gave a great speech on the floor. Bernie Sanders also gave a speech in which they both condemned this, used the term colonial. It's a colonial-style takeover, and it's for vulture funds, as you mentioned. I mean, when you look, Reuters did a report a few months ago looking at how you have people who are unable to get health care, people, their social services have been taken away from them, they're being privatized. I mean, this is, we should describe it as what it is. There's a term for it, it's called colonialism. And of course, Puerto Rico is a country that is independent of the US. It is a commonwealth, but it's a case of taxation without representation. And they don't have representation in terms of voting and the federal government. So it's important to understand that status, and it's also important to understand, well, the case is even worse, as Anthony alluded to. It actually reflects what's happening in some ways internally, especially on communities of color, which again, echoes this white supremacist colonial political structure. So in the case of Detroit, I mean, you have these boards that are being imposed to maintain the finances of these communities that are not elected. In the case of Detroit, I mean, you had a control board that was imposed, but it was imposed at least by a state official, by the governor. In the case of Puerto Rico, I mean, you have the imposition of a colonial-style control board that is not elected. The people of Puerto Rico now have to live under a control board that controls their country's finances that they did not choose.
And pay for it.
Absolutely, they have to pay for it out of their own tax dollars. So certainly, I mean, I think the discourse really needs to be much more explicit. This isn't just a horrible policy, this is colonialism. And of course, it's not just Puerto Rico. I mean, there are other U.S. commonwealths, U.S. territories, which do not have the same representation. And this is taxation without representation. I mean, you have all these patriots in the U.S. talking about the importance of the American Revolution. Certainly, I'm not downplaying the grounds that they had for justifying a revolution, although it was a revolution that was only for white property men. I mean, it was based on slavery, the subjugation of women, etc. But if that revolution is justified, something much more would be justified in Puerto Rico and beyond. And we need to, I think, have that discussion. And it's very commendable and amazing to see the resistance that's been going on. And again, I mean, unfortunately, I've covered it a little bit, but I haven't covered it enough. My colleagues haven't covered it enough. And it's something that's just not really discussed. But I think, when we're talking about building solidarity with movements, Black Lives Matter has expressed solidarity with the resistance in Puerto Rico and other movements. And Palestine. So it's really important to draw the threads between all these interconnected issues.
We have time, one more question?
One more question.
One more question. The gentleman this here. Sorry, there's two of you. Yeah, gentleman this here.
Just get a chance.
Okay, yeah, the guy here. Yeah, please.
So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the role of accountability in nonprofits and the for-profit system, and kind of the comparison between the two in both the international world but also domestically, and how because there's a lot of non-governmental organizations that take on these missions and do these things, and would be feasibly or theoretically good choices to manage refugee camps or do things, but there's this push towards private, for-profit, and non-accountable, and how that ends up working, where donors demand like 100% of my money goes to the starving kid on the street, and I'm not going to give if it doesn't happen that way.
Yeah.
And the NGO community is being starved, and for-profit community is growing a lot. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are.
Yeah. So there's a lot of material about that in the book, especially in relation to Haiti. And the film, in fact, a major part of the film that we're working on talks about the issue of NGOs in Haiti, particularly in Afghanistan. In my mind, the NGOization, which is how I see much of the world moving, has positives and deep, deep negatives. The extreme example is somewhere like, say, South Sudan, where I was living a few years ago for a year in 2015, where it's now a failed state, propped up essentially by one of the world's biggest UN peacekeeping forces, plus NGOs. Now, on the one hand, that to me is positive that the country is not completely collapsed, because if those organisations pulled out tomorrow, it'd be far worse than it is, even though it's on the point of famine. It's now the third biggest refugee crisis in the world after Syria and Afghanistan. It gets virtually no press here at all. On the other hand, when you're there, and this was an issue that I thought about a lot, and I wrote about it when I was there, is do we feel comfortable, we being the international community, the world, call it whatever you want, with essentially what are unelected officials running a country? Now the South Sudanese government exists and it sort of operates, but it's run by war criminals and it's an appallingly corrupt government. So you have NGOs and the UN running the country. Who voted for them? I didn't vote for them. The South Sudanese didn't vote for them. No one voted for them. Now, again, it's not a call to say they should all leave tomorrow. It'd be worse if they left in a place like South Sudan, for sure. But those are really interesting questions that as more and more countries are failing, when the UN and NGOs go in, there are really unresolved questions of accountability and democracy about saying, well, where is the accountability? Haiti, a good example, we talk about in the film and in the book, where after the earthquake in 2010, there were Nepalese troops who had come for the UN. They brought cholera. The country hadn't seen cholera in 100 years. At least 10,000 Haitians have died, hundreds of thousands have been affected. The UN to this day has not taken full responsibility. There's been no compensation. Now, the UN had brought cholera, killed people. Now, to me, that's about as serious an issue as could happen. Haiti's also a really worrying example of a lack of accountability of NGO actions. There are a lot of NGOs doing wonderful work. This is not an NGO bashing session. I think there are some very good organisations out there, big ones and small ones, and I talk about some of them in the book. But there's also a lack of accountability of the NGO world. Often NGOs aren't that keen to be as accountable as they should be. A good example would be the Red Cross America, who in the last 5 years in Haiti and internally, after Hurricane Sandy here in your city, they failed miserably in both cases. They took a lot of money in from the public. People gave because they thought it was a good organisation to support. And there were fundamental failings in both. In Haiti, for example, the Red Cross has claimed to build thousands of houses. It's like 8. ProPublica, a good investigative journalist website, did an investigation last year about this and found that the Red Cross has failed miserably there, and here in the US after Hurricane Sandy. So, to me, the message of that is, don't give to the Red Cross, for one. And secondly, a lot of us, I think, when something happens, like the idea of giving to an organisation because we want to help. You know, if we're stuck in New York or Jerusalem or Sydney, and something happens in South Sudan, most of us aren't going to go to South Sudan, even if we did, what are we going to do there? So you give it to an organisation to help, MSF, Red Cross, someone else, a smaller NGO. But to me, it's about asking more questions about the NGO itself. Is it, for example, engaging local actors? A lot of the problem in Haiti that we talk about in the film and in the book is that routinely foreign organisations aren't giving a great deal of interaction with locals. So when the NGO leaves, the locals have got not much. There's been no training, very little training, very little local support. And not surprisingly, locals say, well, the earthquake happened now 7 years ago. Our country is still, frankly, a disaster. What have these NGOs been doing? Now, I'm not saying none of them are doing good work, but in general, there's a real failure of that system in a place like Haiti. And from my reading and work, I don't think there's been as much self-reflection in the NGO world as there should be. Some organisations, for sure. but often there has not been. And to me, what the public can do is to ask for far more accountability of those organisations before they give money. Ask for more details before you give money after a next disaster, if you choose to do so, about what work has been done, have locals been engaged. Now obviously an organisation could bullshit, like the Red Cross was trying to do about how many houses they built in Haiti. And it's going to be difficult unless you have a massive journalistic team to investigate if it's true or not. And that's difficult, I acknowledge that. But I do think that there needs to be a lot more questions and openness within the NGO world, and I'll finish on this point. NGOs can be for profit as well. You have this sense that NGOs are inherently benign. A lot of people think that in the NGO and general world, and they're not. There are some NGOs that are out to make a profit. There are some NGOs that are doing it for purely humanitarian reasons. The NGO world, I think, has sprung up in the last 30 years and done a lot of good, but also there's not a great deal of regulation, especially in places like Haiti or South Sudan. There's virtually none, in fact. And that's a problem, because a lot of people in those countries, if you ask them, I mean, for example, I'll finish on this, in Haiti, there are UN peacekeepers there, so-called peacekeepers, who have been accused and found guilty of sexually abusing Haitians. It's happened also in parts of Africa with the UN. A lot of Haitians we met said that they felt their country was occupied by the UN. In South Sudan, it's a bit of a more complicated picture, but not dissimilar. So this is not a Trump-style call to retreat from the world and isolate ourselves, far from it. But I do think there needs to be a lot more questions about how the UN and NGOs operate in conflict zones. And because often there's just a sense they're doing good work because they're there. And sometimes they are, but often they're not.
Yeah, if I can just inject one thought on that, I think it's also important to understand the political context. We often have this view that you can just bring NGOs in to solve political problems. But in the case of Haiti, it's important to understand for context that in the past 30 years, the U.S. has backed 2 coups in Haiti, 2 military coups. And of course, when we're talking about the wars in Afghanistan, the wars in Iraq, in Syria, Libya, I mean, in 2011, NATO overthrew Libya's government, and it's been a complete disaster. In the case of Iraq, and we all know what happened in 2003. So it's, as just to underscore Anthony's point, of course some NGOs are doing important work, and some are certainly corrupt. I mean, there's NGOification, there's the NGO industrial complex. But at the same time, even if we have these benevolent NGOs that are doing everything for humanitarian reasons, they can't solve their root political problems. And as you mentioned in the book, I mean, one of these serious political problems is that there is a global capitalist system in which corporations are profiting from all of these conflicts, and it is simply not profitable to solve these problems. And I mean, I guess that'll probably close it up here. Maybe if you just want to add, just to plug your new book, and then I guess you'll probably be signing these as well, but can you talk about what you've been working on now? And where
So I
people,
don't want to talk
and
too
where
much
people
about
can
the
get in
new
touch
book at
with
the
you.
moment. So the new book is just coming in a while, quite a few years, so yes, hold that thought. As I said, you can find my work quite easily online. I write for various publications. As I said, this book just came out in paperback. The film will hopefully be screened this year around the world. And I'd encourage you finally to, if you don't already, to support some independent media by giving them some money, because they'll thank you for it. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you.
So that was great. If you guys would like a copy of the book, you may grab one and get it signed here and pay for it upstairs. Thank you guys so much for joining us.
No, I haven't booked it.
I just want the secret.
I just didn't want to say